Michelangelo Buonarroti lived to a ripe old age, and as a result, he complicates my course planning, since his later work really, in my view, belongs to the Catholic Counter-Reformation or reaction to the Protestant Reformation. So I'm going to return to his dark Last Judgment when I get to mannerism in Unit 9. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo was an artist who not only reflected, but also transformed his time. He is, in fact, the first Western artist whose biography was published while he was still alive. And he was also the first artist whose art made him, in modern terms, a multimillionaire. Michelangelo's roots lie in the early Renaissance, and more specifically in the Florence of Lorenzo de' Medici. He was born in a town near Florence and apprenticed to Ghirlandaio. Remember the other Last Supper that we just saw? Lorenzo de' Medici recognized his talent and invited him to join the new Humanist Academy that he had founded. So let's hear the story from our first video clip. When Savonarola's followers succeeded in banishing the Medici from Florence, Michelangelo traveled to Venice, Bologna, and finally to Rome, where he arrived at the age of 21 and would work for much of his life. So this is a good point to pause in my biography to discuss the Eternal City's revival. During the medieval period, Rome was a one-industry town, and that industry was the church. The consumers, for the most part, were pilgrims who were coming to Rome on pilgrimage. When the popes decamped to Avignon during much of the 14th century, Rome went into a steep decline. When the papacy returned permanently to Rome in the 15th century, a series of strong, if not especially spiritual popes led a drive to rebuild the city and especially its religious buildings. These popes were heavily influenced by the Renaissance and its classicism and humanism. The pope we're going to concern ourselves with the most today, Julius II, who was pope from 1503 to 1513, took the name Julius to show his admiration of Julius Caesar, not, to the best of my knowledge, a notable Christian saint. The drive to beautify and glorify Rome would acquire new urgency when Martin Luther began to challenge church authority. But ironically, the crisis that provoked the Protestant Reformation was objection in the German states to papal efforts to raise money to rebuild St. Peter's and beautify Rome, and to raise this money by selling indulgences. We'll talk about that in the next unit. So this work is not in your textbook, but I've already shown it to you once when we looked at the Rot con Pietà on the right. And if I left it out of this course, you would be totally justified in suing me for educational malpractice. Michelangelo sculpted this work for a cardinal when he was just 23, and it made him instantly famous. Here's what the contemporary art historian Vasari said. "It is certainly a miracle that a formless block of stone could ever have been reduced to perfection that nature is scarcely able to create in the flesh." The statue now sits in St. Peter's. So what, and when you look at these two statues, what is the essential compositional artistic problem of a Pietà? Well, the answer is that Mary is a woman. Her son, Christ, as a man, is going to be larger. So how do you portray Mary holding her dead son without the body of Christ overwhelming Mary or looking impossible? So how do you think Michelangelo did it? Well, let's look first at the defining shape of this composition. It's a pyramid again. The curve of Christ's arm echoes the curve of the winding sheet, while his feet direct our eyes up to Mary's ever-youthful face. By the way, Michelangelo's explanation for this was since she was forever a virgin, she remained ever youthful. The large swath of cloth was necessary to convincingly support the dead body of Christ. And note, too, that Mary's body is unrealistically wide. Hips like that, none of us wants. But again, this is necessary to support the body. And what's amazing is that Michelangelo does not make her look deformed or odd. And part of that is the incredible sweetness and pathos of the face. Note her suppressed emotion and the contrast between Christ's limp, dead hand and Mary's firmer, gesturing hand. By the way, this is the most finished sculpture that Michelangelo ever made, and the only one he ever signed. And by the way, sculptors signing works was very unusual at this point. His signature is actually on the sash crossing Mary's breast. So Michelangelo then returned to Florence, where he produced this masterpiece. The statue is 16.5 feet tall without the base. Like the Pietà, this was instantly hailed as a masterpiece. In fact, the cathedral authorities convened a committee that included Botticelli, Filippino Lippi, and Leonardo da Vinci to decide where the statue should be placed. One interesting little anecdote. Leonardo wanted to put it in an obscure corner. He was apparently jealous of Michelangelo, and Michelangelo, in turn, was scathing on the subject of Leonardo, whom he claimed had a lot of brilliant ideas that he never managed to finish or execute. A not entirely unfair accusation. At any rate, Leonardo lost his argument, and the committee ultimately chose the spot Michelangelo wanted, right beside the main entrance to the Piazza della Signoria, or town hall. There go the hounds again, where it stood until 1873, when it was removed to a museum for safekeeping. Sorry about that. Looks like the UPS guy has arrived again. The only real resemblance between Michelangelo's and Donatello's David is the nudity, although Michelangelo resisted the impulse to add a silly hat. The nudity was still viewed as slightly shocking, but David's sculpture did not provoke the same unease as Botticelli's. Now, it may be partly because at this point, the Florentines were more accustomed to nudity. They'd seen a lot more statues emulating the classics. But it also seems to me that Michelangelo's David does not have the disturbing sort of pedophiliac undertones of Donatello's work. Still, Michelangelo's debt to classical sculpture is very clear. So compare the contrapposto stance of his David with our old friend, the spear thrower by Polyclitus, and David's musculature with the Hellenistic bronze boxer. But Michelangelo moved beyond classical models to create tremendous dramatic tension. Donatello and Verrocchio both chose to portray the victorious young David after he had defeated Goliath. But Michelangelo's David, he's just spotted Goliath. He's preparing to fight. So notice how one side of his body remains closed and relaxed, but the other side is poised, it's tense, it's ready to spring. The body stands in a resilient curve like a strung bowstring. The hands and feet and head are all oversized. That renders them more protective, more expressive, but also remember that the statue was designed to be seen from below. And Michelangelo intended that we focus our eye on the two elements of David's victory, the head that came up with the plan and the hand that executed the plan. A brilliant brain directing a fit and agile body, that was the Renaissance ideal. And now we come to the great drama of the Sistine Chapel. By the way, this painting of Pope Julius II was painted by Raphael, whom we'll turn to in our next and final lectures in this unit. So Michelangelo left behind a detailed biography. It was basically dictated to his biographer. So we have a blow-by-blow account of his love-hate relationship with his most famous patron, told, of course, from Michelangelo's often self-serving perspective. So let's watch another video clip. I'm showing you just a few brief excerpts from a BBC video that describes the process and pain of painting the Sistine Chapel. And it's intriguingly, it follows the efforts of two artists to replicate just one portion of the panel using fresco on the ceiling of a Catholic church in London. Wish we had more time because I think it's very interesting. As always, the link to the full video is on Moodle. At any rate, it was an extraordinary challenge for an artist who had not worked in fresco since he was a young apprentice to Ghirlandaio. In fact, Michelangelo himself thought that the Pope was setting him up for failure, and it was a plot by the evil Raphael or Bramante. He was very jealous of his fellow artists. By the way, the actor playing Michelangelo was reading from Michelangelo's biography, which again was largely dictated to his biographer by Michelangelo himself. The Sistine Chapel is the private chapel of the Pope, located between the papal apartments and the Basilica of St. Peter's. It's here that the College of Cardinals meets to elect a new pope. The chapel was built by Pope Sixtus IV, which is how we get the name Sistine, in the late 15th century, but the original ceiling was simply blue with stars. The lower walls were decorated by a series of mostly Florentine artists. The end wall, which we see here, the Last Judgment, was also painted by Michelangelo between 1535 and 1541. I've chosen to discuss this work in more detail when we get to Mannerist art. So we will return to Michelangelo. Note the gate in the foreground. You mostly just see the newel posts in this painting. It separates the area that the priests may enter and the area for the lay people. Walking toward the altar, one passes from the life of Noah to the life of Adam to the creation of the world. In other words, in reverse chronological order. But this compositional plan, which Michelangelo chose, ensured that the expulsion from the garden falls directly above the gate that separates the laities and the priest section of the chapel, and that the creation falls directly above the altar. On the covered side, in those triangles, Michelangelo painted sibyls. These were sort of prophetesses, Old Testament prophets, and the ancestors of Christ. By the way, everything that looks like architecture is an illusion. It's all, at least that is above the cornice, it's all painting. Michelangelo framed the narrative scenes with 20 male nudes, or ignudi. And art historians still debate why Michelangelo placed these in the ceiling. Their religious purpose is quite unclear. He was fascinated by the male nude. Clearly, they're based on the Belvedere sculpture, which is shown here. It was a Hellenistic sculpture from about 50 A.D. that was in the Vatican collection and that Michelangelo studied very closely. By the way, Michelangelo was also present when the Laocoon was uncovered during the excavations and rebuilding of Rome. So that also influenced him, and you can see that. So here's one of the sibyls. These were Greek female mythological seers, and they were thought to have foretold the birth of Christ. Again, we see the marriage of classical and Christian themes that is so characteristic of Michelangelo. Note the sibyl's spiraling figure, how she pirouettes on her toes as she twists into space behind her. Again, this sense of controlled, powerful movement is typical of Michelangelo's painting and sculpture. And notice, too, that in this Michelangelo inverts the usual Renaissance pyramid. And here we see the prophet Jeremiah. Now, he's the ominous prophet who warned of the sorrow and oppression that must accompany salvation. So note how the figure just pulls downward, expresses this mourning for Jerusalem. And remember, also intriguingly, it's placed directly above the papal throne. So the prophet's sorrow is the Pope's sorrow. And it's important to remember that this was painted at a time when the warrior Pope Julius II was basically engaged in a life and death struggle with the King of France. France would invade Italy in 1492 and sack Rome in 1527. This is another painting we've seen almost too often. Remember our syllabus at the beginning of class? And like other images we've seen, it's been very tempting for advertisers. So how about a little pizza? So let's just try to bring a fresh eye to this piece. I think it's very difficult. What did you see? I'm especially struck by God the Father's extraordinary energy. Look at that billowing cloak, his vigorously outstretched hand, his windblown hair. Adam, by contrast, is almost entirely passive. He's awaiting God's touch to come to vibrant life. Look at that limp wrist. The only spark of life really is in his face because his eyes are locking with God's, and that's lifting him partly off the rock. The rest of his body seems almost bound to that rock. But again, we know Adam's inert body is about to move for the first time, brought to life by God's touch. Again, Michelangelo is all about action that is about to happen, and our anticipation that he creates that action is going to erupt at any moment. So here's another extremely famous painting, the expulsion, temptation and expulsion of Adam and Eve. Notice especially that splendidly foreshortened angel casting the pair from Eden. Now, the tomb of Julius II was supposed to be Michelangelo's masterpiece. His original plan included more than 40 statues, but the family ran out of patience and funds, and only a few of the statues were sculpted. There was also a huge dispute about the money. I won't go into that. Watch the whole video if you want to learn about it. So some of these statues, in fact, remained even incomplete. So here's a quick video account, and then we'll look at some of the statues more closely. Here we see Moses, which is the one major completed statue that remained on the tomb. If you're wondering about the horns, a passage in the Old Testament that describes Moses uses a term that could mean horns and could mean rays of light. Modern scholars translate it as rays of light, but many older statues of Moses will show horns. The debt Michelangelo owes to classical sculpture is again clear. Although, again, you see that poised to spring attitude, which is Michelangelo's trademark. Oh, and here's a comparison with the seated Roman boxer. Again, look at that musculature and the weighting, sort of the suppressed power. The slave statues are actually maybe my favorite statues by Michelangelo, along with the Pietà. To me, it seems as if the slaves are really still bound by the stone, especially the statues that aren't quite finished. In fact, I actually rather like that they're not finished. I mean, you see the slaves in the stone are emerging from the stone. You have a real sense of that creative process. And just as an FYI, Michelangelo also sculpted the tombs of his patron, Lorenzo de' Medici, and his brother Giuliano, who was murdered by enemies of the Medici in the cathedral. He did this late in his career, long after their deaths, but just another example of Michelangelo's sculpture. Now we move to the last, away from painting and sculpture toward architecture, because Michelangelo did it all. Now, Michelangelo viewed himself primarily, though, as a sculptor, and in many ways, his muscled, twisting, almost unnaturally solid painted figures are really sculpture transformed to a two-dimensional painting. But Michelangelo was an architect as well, one of several who got roped into the gigantic enterprise of the 16th century, constructing the new Rome and especially the new St. Peter's. Before we get to Michelangelo, I'm going to detour to the other great architect of St. Peter's, Donato Bramante. Now, you've heard Michelangelo's disparaging judgment of Bramante. Art historians do not share his disdain. It was Bramante who introduced high Renaissance architecture, first to Milan and then to Rome. Like Leonardo, he worked for Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. When the French invaded Milan in 1499, Bramante fled to Rome, where he quickly came to the attention of the cardinal who would become Julius II. This small, really tiny gem of a church, the Tempietto, and by the way, it's a College Board favorite, was probably designed for Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain to celebrate the final reconquest of Spain from the Muslims in 1492. Note the clear classical influence, that comparison to the Temple of Vesta, the slender Doric columns, the symmetry and proportion, but also that ribbed dome that in some ways echoes Brunelleschi's triumph in Florence. This work was a major reason why Julius II tapped Bramante to design the new St. Peter's, a building that was intended to reinforce Rome's status as the new Jerusalem and Rome's Pope as the leader of Christendom. By the way, one point I didn't make earlier, I don't think I realized this, I heard this on one of my lectures. You see these domed temples depicting Old Testament Jerusalem. Actually, what they're thinking about is the Dome of the Rock, which of course is a Muslim structure, but also domed. But many of these depictions of the temple are really depictions of the Muslim monument. Just kind of an interesting point. There's the Temple of Vesta. Sorry, I didn't have that earlier. Okay, Bramante's original plan called for a Greek cross, in other words, equal-sided transepts and naves. When he died, the Pope initially appointed Raphael to succeed him, but Raphael died as well. After proposing that the nave be elongated, Michelangelo took over in 1547 when he was in his 70s and proposed reverting to a modified form of Bramante's original plan. Michelangelo designed the dome of St. Peter's, which he modeled on Brunelleschi's famous dome. Eventually, the plan would be modified again to create a longer nave and a cruciform structure, mostly because St. Peter's needed to be large enough to handle crowds. I'm going to show us that final version of St. Peter's, and we'll look at it more closely when we get to the Baroque era. It took a long time to build St. Peter's. But here you see Michelangelo's dome. And again, the resemblance to Brunelleschi's dome should be clear, but we'll also see that Michelangelo added some characteristic features of his own. Michelangelo also took on the challenge of redesigning the Capitoline Hill. This was the citadel or the Acropolis of ancient Rome, the ground between the Roman Forum and the Field of Mars, which is an open area used for military training. Like most of Rome, it had fallen into disrepair, and Pope Paul III wanted to rebuild it as a monument to Rome's revitalization and to the centrality of the church. So Michelangelo reoriented the architecture to face the Vatican, and he combined classically inspired buildings with this geometric piazza, which drew the new structures together. It remains one of the most famous and most beautiful examples of urban planning, really urban renewal. The Florentine Palazzo also came to Rome, and Michelangelo was involved in the design of some of these. You note here the palace built for the Farnese family by Antonio da Sangallo. The family of Pope Paul III were the Farneses. You should also see major similarities with the Palazzo Medici and other Renaissance palaces. You're really not that likely to have to identify a specific Renaissance palace so much as to recognize the features of a kind of generic Renaissance palace. The use of archways on the ground floor, that heavy prominent cornice, the internal orientation around an arcaded courtyard. Note, too, the Greek pediment-style decorations over the windows on the second level. We're getting close to the end, I promise. Let's close with a last video clip about Michelangelo, this time his final career as an architect.